Welcome to WorkSpan TV. I'm Ryan Johnson from World at Work. Today I'm in the studio with David Cichelli of the Alexander Group. We're talking about the new survey, 2012 Sales Compensation Trends. And David, I want to welcome you back.
Thank you, Ryan. Glad to be here.
David, this was the 10th iteration of this survey, 10th annual iteration of this survey. World at Work joined you this year. Thanks for allowing us to ride along in your terrific survey. But I'm wondering about the 10 years of history here. What have we learned over 10 years about sales compensation trends?
Thanks, Ryan. You know, the Sales Compensation Trends Surveys is done every year in the December timeframe in anticipation of the next year's business planning for sales departments. And the reason we call it Trend Survey is because we repeat the questions of things having to do with budgets, expenses, and headcount, and how effective the sales compensation program is. So, having looked at 10 years of data, it kind of reveals some interesting things. For example, you might ask the question, how well is our sales compensation program performing? And you would think you would want most companies to report a high number of companies reporting that the programs are doing well. But every year it generally is a third. A third of the companies say it's going really well, and a third of the companies say it's acceptable, and a third of the company says it's unacceptable. So the takeaway from looking at the data over 10 years is that sales compensation programs tend to provide challenges, and in some years it's going to be working okay, and some years it's not going to be working okay, and that's all right. The other thing about trends also is that if you look over a period of time is how frequently they change their compensation programs. It's pretty stable. About every year, about 90% of the companies change their sales compensation programs. Material changes, 70% of those are actually material changes. The other, up to the 90%, are small changes. And then the other question is, what percentage of the companies redo their compensation programs top to bottom? The number generally remains about the same year after year, and that's from 10 to 15%. So knowing that, most sales compensation programs probably have a shelf life of 5 to 7 years. And that is that after that period of time, it's time to redo it top to bottom. And so a trend survey allows you to see the patterns that are occurring year in and year out.
So I think what I heard you just say is that change is pretty constant, and if you're in an organization and you're dissatisfied with your sales compensation plan, you're going to make a change, you may be normal.
Yes, in fact, it's actually the expectation is that the sales compensation program is something that migrates all the time. And sometimes you're doing it really well, and sometimes it's getting a little bit old and not working so effective and requires an investment of time. But to the compensation planner, what does that mean? It means that these programs are not stable and constant. They're constantly being updated and modified based upon what's happening to the company. And that's the normal, and the data supports that.
So we went through a big recessionary period in the last few years, David, and of course, as we said, you had 10 years of data here. What happened during this recessionary period, 08, 09, and maybe it even splashed into 2010?
Yeah, so that really is interesting when you actually can watch the data flow year after year, and then a recession occurs. So what happens to the data? Well, a couple of things tend to spike. For example, the number of plans that are viewed as successful drops as you enter a recessionary period. Another interesting element too is, of course, the amount of money that's available for increases and rises in compensation levels drops also. In fact, in the 2009 time frame, there was actually a reduction in incentive dollars that were paid. So a recession does in fact impact compensation programs. There's also an interesting characteristic that takes place. Sales executives in the survey are asked to estimate how well they're going to do the following year. And during periods of recession, as you're entering a recession, they tend to dramatically overestimate how well they're going to perform. The result is they set pretty aggressive quotas, and the result of that is that their payouts are generally lower than they wanted them to be. Now, the other thing that occurs on the way out of a recession, they do the opposite. They tend to underestimate their own growth. This particularly happened which we saw in the 2010 survey, is that they underestimated, gave out easy quotas, and guess what? Paid a lot more than they expected. So recessions tend to have this lead-lag problem associated with them.
But optimism, it seems, is reigning in some of these surveys until maybe you get to the depth of the recession, and then the optimism switch flips to the pessimism.
It does switch to the pessimism, and they terribly underestimate their own performance, and of course that means easier quotas, and that means higher payouts. Now for this 2012, we just picked up an interesting piece of information, is that the optimism that they had last year has actually softened a bit. And now, in other words, the 2012 year is not going to be as positive as they thought they were going to be. But if I followed my own logic, they may be underestimating how good 2012 might be. I don't know.
So the survey is chock full of a lot of data points, David, and what I did observe in there was some pretty good optimism going into 11. The year finished not as strong maybe as people thought, but maybe you could just cover, and I'm sure that's why people are watching this. Let's talk about what's going to happen in 2012.
Okay, 2012. So of course we want to know what the numbers are. First of all, what is the average increase going to be in compensation payouts on the incentive side? 3%. In fact, it's going to be a 3% year all the way around. The other question is about the base salaries. Now, during the recession, we saw a dramatic drop in the number of companies granting base pay increases. I think that was true for sales forces. It might have also been true for their employee populations. Well, as we enter in 2012, the number that are granting pay increases has jumped dramatically. Pay increases to the base salary has jumped dramatically. That number is also 3%. So we're looking at a 3% OTE improvement, 3% on the base and 3% on the target incentive amount. And the amount of dollars available for base salary increases is jumping because the number of companies that are granting base pay increases has jumped dramatically.
Well, I want to thank you, David Cichelli, Senior Vice President, Alexander Group. And for Research in Brief, World at Work and WorkSpan TV, I'm Ryan Johnson.